Hello, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for coming to my Excel presentation here. Please use the Dropbox link to download the companion file here so that you can follow along. We will be using exclusively this file for purposes of following along, and then at the end it will just be watch. No work is required if you're if you're nervous about that. But I will be going through the many activities and kind of lessons there are within the workbook here. If you do, once you download it, have a yellow bar at the top that says enable content or enable editing. Go ahead and click on that just until you have the regular just Excel window here. Yours may look a little bit different because I have a dark theme on. It's easier on the eyes. But I'll just go ahead and kind of get started with my little intro here. I have always wanted to put together kind of an Excel from scratch workbook that is focused not so much on like pivot tables that everybody kind of advertises and pushes and everything, but something from the very, very beginning. As you'll see here, we talk about the very file type and structure of a worksheet, but I've always kind of wanted to do this, so thank you to the Data Conference team and all of you for showing up, because conferences aren't anything without attendees. And I also want to thank my department, RegTech, for supporting me last week in this and ongoing by allowing me to have time for this and actually sitting through this once already. So, and then a special thank you to Rebecca Berkowitz and Christina Smith, who are co-presenters and are going to, one of them or both of them are going to take the reins from me at the end of this to go over kind of what we're doing with Excel in the actual day-to-day or week-to-week of RegTech. So I do want to say, I hope after this session, you are more confident in Excel and maybe you even learn something. This workbook is, again, freely available at the Dropbox link for you to follow along or just take and run if you really want to. And it's going to be just a relatively quick run through each of these tabs. It will take probably about an hour to go through the actual workbook. And then the rest of the session will focus on, again, what RegTech is doing week to week with what you can do with interbook formulas and nested formulas and things that are even further beyond what we're going to talk about here. So hopefully people have had time to download it and click through the, again, just click through the enable editing or allow content links at the top, or the buttons at the top of the page on the yellow bars, and your page looks similar to mine here. And let's get started. So this is the basics tab. We're starting from the very beginning again. So a workbook is an Excel file which ends in .xls or xlsx. You may not have file types visible on your computer. And you will also note when you downloaded this that it's XLSM, which means it's macro enabled. So that XLS is still there, but just to keep in mind that while I'm very happy to be presenting this, it's impossible to present everything that Excel has and can do, but the vast majority of workbooks are going to be identified that way. A sheet is what most people call a tab. It's these at the bottom here, the tabs. It's just called sheet 1 or whatever when you make a new one. And then the rows, I like remembering as you row across water. So it's the horizontal one, it's the flat one, and then columns support buildings. And so they're the vertical ones. So it's rows like this and columns like this. And over here, you'll see we have in C here the kind of execution of each of these. This is a file. This sheet is called basics. This is row 4, and this is column C. And then the cells are where the rows and columns intersect. So this is cell C6. Now with that out of the way, it's just kind of some quick vocabulary there. This is the formula bar up top here. This is where you type in all of the functions and any other symbols and even values that you may have on reports and other things that you have throughout your daily duties. And this is where you can edit formulas. You can also edit them in the actual workbook with an F2 here, and you can type directly into the cell. Real quick before we go just any further, if you can right click on the tab down here, you'll see an option to protect sheet. And if you click on that, you'll see a little pop-up here. Ignore all of this pop-up. You can just hit OK. And I've also enabled all of the sheets just like this to have some protections on them, or most of the sheets to have some protections on them, just so the formulas and some of the functionality is preserved. But if you do find yourself just wanting to go into the actual content and everything, there are no passwords on this. You can just right click on each of the tabs and you can just hit unprotect sheet and you can do whatever you'd like with the entire workbook. All right, so cell content. This is important to go over to talk about functions and formulas in general. There's nothing, which is just empty cells, or nothing. Values, which I like to call flat cells or flattened cells, because generally values don't go into Excel cells without being a formula first. And then we have formulas, which often include references and lots of other things to other cells, which is a reference is an address to another cell that we'll get to in just about 8 rows here. Formulas make up the vast majority of Excel content typically that is worked in Excel, and they have several parts. A starter, which alerts Excel that there will be a formula in this cell and tells it to evaluate and apply formula rules and logic to it. A formula can be started with an equals, a plus, or a minus, and Excel will generally insert the equals ahead of it. So equals is typically what you see here at the top of the formula bar. You will also note that despite this being the starter cell, there is an apostrophe here. If you would like to stop Excel from evaluating a formula, you can put an apostrophe in front of it, and Excel will never display the first apostrophe, and it will not use the logic there to evaluate this, because obviously this isn't an actual formula, it's just a bunch of symbols. So I put an apostrophe in front of it so you can see it. Numbers, self-explanatory, and then symbols. All of these have different uses. Some of them traditional, like parentheses, where you want to group things. Some of them have to do with references or shorthand formulas, such as the ampersand or the $sign. And some of them are just used in sheets like exclamation points, and ranges such as colon, or there's logic operators as well, like greater than, less than, or equals. Functions are what people generally call formulas. They are the actual properties that are put into the formula bar that can be used together inside of each other or one after another in succession in different cells. I just have 3 real quick here: sum, if, and row. Sum is a very, very, very common one, obviously, because we need to add a lot of student numbers up. And then if is a logical operator. We'll get to that in 3 tabs here. And then row will give you the just row of the cell or of the reference that you have inside of the formula or the function. Now, that's the second time I've said cell reference. You can, in Excel, reference another cell by just including its column and row identifier together as one term. For instance, this cell is C20, and I have the formula up here generating that, so you can paste this actually anywhere. If you were to leave the sheet unprotected, you can go ahead and paste that anywhere to get that. So C6 is up here. That's the address of this one. You can, this is A1, that's just the reference. So if you want to get a value from another cell, then you just need to put that cell's address or reference into the formula or function that you're working with. So the most basic formulas I could think of were the equals 5 plus 5 there. So if you can just type exactly that into this cell, and then you see that that is exactly all it takes to do a formula. And you get a little great job there, which I think is important. And then the second one here is just to get a cell reference kind of started off here to show you the very first cell reference, which is actually probably another most basic formula. You can just hit equals, and you can either type B24 here, or you can actually click on where the cell is, and you get that nice highlighted animation around the cell, and you'll get a blue field or some other color depending on how many references you already have in a formula. In this case, I just have the one, so looks like it's blue this time. And you can just hit enter, and that will move the, that will reference the cell's value and just become that value. So that said, just go ahead down here to the navigation sheet and click on that, and we will move forward to some quick navigation tips. These are things that aren't necessarily related to functions and formulas, but they can help you navigate Excel files or just other things. Shift selects, you can hold it and you can click, or you can use arrow keys. So you can click and it'll select an entire range here, or you can hit shift and you can select individually. Control jumps. And this is one I don't think people know much in general, so I like showing it because you can just hold control and use the arrow keys, and your selection will jump to the end of the block or from an end of a block to a beginning of a new block of text or of content. It's just as long as the cell's not empty or it is empty, it'll jump to the next not empty cell. And then control and shift together will actually jump and select at the same time. You can use this to select entire ranges. Alt enables menu shortcuts like Alt MUS here. Alt MUS is actually a sum formula. And when you use that, it will automatically populate based on the adjacent cells that are next to it there. Just kind of a range it thinks it wants to use. And there's Alt ESV actually pastes values as well. So we'll say we referenced here, but now we want that to just be a 1 instead of a formula. You can copy that, and you can Alt ESV. It's not working. Alt ESV. Oh, my Excel froze. One moment. And then you have several options for filling as well. You can select an entire range and the data that you want to fill in. And I actually just learned that once you've filled in that data, or once you have the data selected that you wanted to fill in, you can actually just double click right here, and it will, as long as there are cells adjacent to it. So let me do this real quick. As long as there are cells right next to it, it will actually fill down once you double click on that handle. I didn't actually know that before last week. Or you can select the range, hit Control D to fill down and Control R to fill across, which is very handy for filling in Excel formulas with relative references or absolute and relative references across several worksheets, which we have done recently in many workbooks for RegTech. Editing again, if you hit F2 on any formula, it will allow you to go in and edit the formula in the cell here on the screen. It will also show you any references that you have in that function and formula, so you can see what you're doing, and you can even drag the reference around so that it can change what it actually does. Recalculating is used for large worksheets, or if you have something like random numbers that you just want to run through and have recalculate repeatedly. You can hit F9 to do that, and that will just push a recalculation through. If you ever want to change your recalculation to manual, just go to Formulas up on the ribbon, Calculation Options, and you can hit Manual, and Excel will no longer calculate. You will then find yourself going, why isn't this working? And you'll have to recalculate because everyone always forgets that on manual. All right, now moving on to the Functions tab here. Some of the most common functions, again, I could think of are like sum, count, average, max, and min. And then I also included some actual math class type functions there. This Excel is way more than a glorified calculator, but it can be a glorified calculator if you'd like it to be. I don't have any examples for the trigonometry and algebra here, but I do have examples for the sum, count, average, max, and min here. I have these numbers generating randomly, just to show that here with F9 real quick. And we have sum, which adds up a range of numbers, count, which will count how many numbers are in that range, average, which will give you the average of that number, which does not include blanks. It will include zeros, but it will not include blanks. We'll get to that in just a minute. It's relevant to like a GPA example. Max, which gives you the highest of the numbers, and minimum, which gives you the lowest of the numbers. The actual use formula from the use column here is put right here next to it, so you can see what's going on. You can also unprotect the sheet if you wanted to, because if you click up here, it'll tell you it's protected. So I'll just go ahead and unprotect it for the moment here, so you can see that the C2 colon G2 is a range, and it's selecting all 5 of those numbers. And I just have them on individual rows to make it more clear that while they're all the same number when they recalculate, they're all being referenced by the different formulas on the different rows. And then you'll see here that 73 is the maximum, and it's returning 73, and 2 is the minimum or the lowest, and this is returning the 2, or evaluating it 2. So if you think this is great and you want to find more, there's many more in this, but I just want to get to a general kind of how to use a function if you've never seen it before real quick here. So the first thing is finding the formula, or the function rather, that you want. You can go to the Formulas tab, and you can see the function library here. I've shrunk my window for presentation purposes, but normally it'll show up something like this. And you can click on a category. You can also just do a web search for whatever you're looking for. Everyone has asked that question already, whatever the question is, whatever the function is that you're looking for. And there's lots and lots of helpful people online that I've been learning from for the past 20 years of Googling just any question I ever had, even before Google, Yahooing any question I had in Excel. And this is all entirely just self-taught over the years. And so if I can teach it to myself, then hopefully I can pass at least one thing on to everybody else here. If there are any tips to learn specific functions as we need them, once you've found the function, yes. Reading the function's parameters is like getting a recipe, just to stay on theme there, and seeing all the ingredients that you have within the actual function. So when you type a formula, start with equals, and that's the formula, and then you need like a function or some reference or something. So the picture here is length, which is a very, very basic formula, and it needs one ingredient, which is text, just any text. So down here we actually have this len formula for length, referencing B19, and B19 is covered up here because it's not actually referencing B19. I inserted a bunch of rows, so that's not updated. But if you click on the formula here, it's B29 that it's referencing, which is right next to it. And it'll tell you that there are 59 characters, which is spaces, symbols, and letters, and numbers. There are 59 characters in this cell. So you can get that if you ever need it. You may not, but you might need upper, lower, left, right, mid, and concatenate, which are other cells. You can go ahead and type in len formula right here if you'd like. Just equals len, open the parentheses. You'll see that little text right there, just like this picture. And you can go ahead and click on any other cell. And you can actually just hit enter, since this is a very basic formula. Another thing I just learned of all things. You can just hit enter without the last parenthesis, and it will actually add the last parenthesis in there for you. If your formula gets more complex, Excel may not catch on to that, and it will throw you an error and suggest a place to put a parenthesis. So I just double check Excel there when it's saying, hey, do you want to accept this correction, and make sure that it's actually doing what you want it to do. Here we have some demonstration text here for each of these 6 text-related formulas. And some example formulas. Again, the rows are going to be off because these were pasted in as a static, but Excel updated them when I inserted the rows. So you can see the differences between how the Excel will dynamically adjust what the references are inside of a formula. So if this was referencing, or it is referencing A33, and we were to have the sheet unprotected and we were to insert the row here, you'll see that now it's referencing A34. So that Excel will keep that constant, just so you can have all of your formulas constantly referencing everything relative to where they are. If you want to lock that down, you can throw a $sign in front of the column or in front of the row if you don't want it changing. And then you can insert that, and it will still work because I did a cut paste type of formula. So the other thing to know with reference versus, or with relative versus absolute, is that if you copy paste, the reference will stay the same. But if you cut and paste or insert delete, then the reference, if you copy paste, then the reference will change if it doesn't have a $sign in front of that portion of the reference. If you cut and paste, then it will stay the same no matter what. So when you have it absolute, it will stay the same no matter what, regardless of if you cut and paste or if you copy paste. Again, just to show that here. Let's remove these again. And we're just going to copy this to above it. And you'll see that it now has capitalized all of this try with some other functions here. So you can go through here and you can see the examples of what each of these formulas functions does to this text. I've emphasized the mid and the right formulas by aligning them to kind of where they are in the initial text here. And then for the concatenate at the bottom here, you can actually join text together. And this is typically done with several cell references. So in this case, we are referencing the 3 cells above this concatenate formula. And while it's a long word, it just means join, it just means smush it together. And you'll also note I've put empty quotes in between each of the cell references. That's so it's somewhat readable. So if I were to delete that and hit enter, you'll see that it goes straight from left to get, which is left, get, right is the order we're talking here. And it's a little less readable, not actually less readable, but it's just better to have the space in there. So another faster way to concatenate is actually to use the ampersand, which is Shift-7, and you can join much faster than typing out concatenate there. Just make sure you have your ampersands in and any text is in quotes, and then cell references are alone, just surrounded by 2 ampersands. So you can go ahead and play around with those in this little space here. These boxes are kind of playgrounds for the protected versions of the sheets. And before we go any further here, we're just going to scroll right back up and go over here to some everyday examples. So sums are typically used to total columns and total totals as well. So the light area here is kind of the source data, the data that was populated by a report or something, or say you just have a field of data and you want to just total it. You can put the sum at the end there. And then you can put this another sum at the end of all of the other totals, and you can get a grand total as well. interesting to note, if you don't really want the subtotals, sum does also work two-dimensionally, whereas these are just referencing a row of cells or a column of cells. You can actually reference an entire array or a row, rows and columns together to get a sum of an entire field without doing like this two-step process. And you'll notice recalculating every time I do that, but that's just to kind of show the power of the references as opposed to hard coding formulas, because in a regular calculator, then you would have to type in each number. But here we can just type in the cells and it will add up whatever's in that cell. And you can even copy this on down to somewhere else and it will total whatever is next to it. And that's the relative reference working for you there. As for average here and count, first of all, count, we'll say 5, again, made up students. Oh, I just need to say before we go any further, there is no actual student data in this entire workbook. Everything has been randomized or created from scratch, or used a British name bank that was just, I found online that just had some example names for just test data. So don't worry about any of that. Okay, that said, there are 5 just made up student IDs here, and we have a count formula running on those. So you can know that there's just 5 in the list. Obviously, you wouldn't really need to count that, but say you have several hundred and you just need to know how many, then you can have a count. As for, say, grade points here, we'll say we need to take the average. And we have the average formula, which is referencing these 3 cells and giving you the average there. So when I said the average, when I talked about the average formula earlier, I talked about how it does not include blanks, but it does include zeros. So in the case of some of the grade point calculations that we actually do, there's the difference between a student who has not taken a class and a student who has taken a class and received no grade points for it. In this case, Excel is right there with us and will not include the blank if it's there as a blank in the average calculation. You'll see that this first one is the same for both of these students. The second one is the same, but then the third one is blank here and 0 here, and you'll note the difference in the averages there. So the Excel average formula is adjustable. Your turn. If you'd like here, you can use these 5 numbers just like over here, and you can try to write a sum formula and an average, count, max, or min formula right here with these numbers, and fill in all those boxes if you'd like. We will go ahead and move on here. Try to keep moving, run a little slow. Other utility functions, it's not just math and text. There's also dates and locations and randomization in Excel. The date will take in a month argument, a day argument or ingredient, and a year. And you can see that here, how it has the three cells referenced, and it will return an actual formatted date for you. Useful for things like if you're doing like projects or calendars or something, you just need to do something in Excel without going all the way to put it in Outlook yet. Today will always return today's date. So I have seen this change about 30 times, I think, while working on this. And just so we're talking about it in a kind of literal sense, the Microsoft date code is how Excel stores dates. It is the number of days since January 1st, 1900. That's literally all there is to it. So each additional day is a +1 to the full value. And it is technically a date time code. So any value that is less than 1 will affect the time. If you want to do that math, go ahead. We're not going to get into it right now, but an hour is then less than 1, minute even less. So, and then day, month, and year will all return the day, month, or year from a date code that you're targeting. So in this case, we're targeting the day, month, and year of today +1, which evaluates us at tomorrow, or the 17th. So the day will be 17, the month will still be 11, and the year will somehow be 2021. Column is the number of the column. And I'm doing this one first because the columns are all named letters. So it's a little bit counterintuitive because you'd kind of expect it to return I in this case, because that's the column we're in, but instead it returns column 9, and that can be important for things like lookups, which we'll get into again later. Rows obviously are pretty straightforward there. Row 49, it returns 49. And then rand between, which is what's running all of the randomization on this workbook. I use rand between, and then I just give it whatever numbers or whatever range I want to give it, and it will just generate a number. See here, at random. And I'm just holding down F9 here. Nothing's wrong, but it will just return between 0 and 100. Logic. So now that we've gotten kind of past some of the basic functionality here, or at least reviewed some of it, we need to review some logic before we go further. So operators are things like, first of all, true and false, which are values and functions. They're results of logical tests or if statements. And they're also functions because they do evaluate to 0 and 1. And 0 and 1 can be used in a formula to say something's true or something's false, if you ever find yourself needing to do that. So and, or, and not are 3 of the most common like logical operators that you would put inside of an if or a conditional statement that you can use to test certain things. So in this case, we are testing to see if all of these are 1, or to say it more literally, if this and this and this and this and this are all true. In this case, we're just using 1s and 0s because it'd be a lot harder to see on one screen if we were using true and false. And you'll see that this row is missing missing a single 1, and it's false. And this one is the same basic formula, but all of these are 1, so it's evaluating it true. Or just requires 1 true in a range to be true. In this case here, we have our 1 true. It's true, and no trues, so it's false. Not just inverts it. So if you're just testing for something and then you want to flip it, if you want to use an equals and then say not around it, you can do that. There's several reasons you might want to do that. In this case, a 1 evaluates it false. And then XOR, or exclusive OR, I'm not going to go into because it's always confused me and typically doesn't actually help, but just type a 1 in there if you want to try to make all the maroon cells true. See if you can figure it out yourself. I just don't, I don't get it. You know, it just goes back and forth. So you can also use these operators mid-formula to compare the values. They will return a true or false as well, much like and, or, not, and XOR. Equals can be used past the start of the formula. So in this case, equals. All right, let's go back here and references. Okay, so equals to start the formula, and then a cell reference, an equal sign to set them equal to each other and see if they are in fact equal to each other. And in this case, 2 does not equal 1, so it's false. Go ahead and just change that to a 2. I'm going to go ahead and fill these in as well. So we're just making these true as we go along. And then greater than works the exact same way as equals. It's just the left side should be greater. And then less than, I'm not going to finish because there's a surprise down here if you do. But you would have to have the left side less than the right side. All right, let's move on to the logic. So this is where we actually use the operators and the to test actual values and why we would want true or false functions to, values to be given to us so we can actually do things based on if things are true or if things are false. So if functions take a test, and if that test is true, then one of the conditions is used. So we'll open up our So we'll open up our ingredients here, and you'll see that there's a logical test, a comma, a value if it's true, a comma, and a value if it's false. Now these are optional, and if will otherwise just return true or false. But if it's going to return a true or false, and you fill in the true condition or the false condition or value, then it will return that instead. So in this case, we have a very simple formula here. It's just if this cell is 5, then say if it's 5. If it's 6, it'll say it's not 5. And that's all that is just this right here. So if, open parentheses, C5 equals 5 is the test. In this case, it does not equal 5. So instead of the, sorry, I had this from an earlier draft. It has 5, comma, not 5. So since it's false right now, it's saying not 5. But once it is true, it'll say 5 again. Very basic. Now let's throw some into the if. This is if you have, say, certain student information or something and you want to get like subgroups or other information out of it. You can say every single row that you want or every single value that you want has an X next to it. Then you can use the Sumifs formula, or we'll get to a more practical example, to isolate those totals. In this case, we have the 4, the 7, and the other 7 here, which is 18. But you'll see that the there we go. You'll see that the two ranges that are being referenced here are D14 through D18, which is the gold right here, and B14 through B18, which is the maroon. So the gold is being checked against this criteria within Sumif. And that's what it's doing, is it takes that first range you give it, and it says, is that an X? Okay, is the next one an X? And so on down the line. And if B14 is an X, like it says here, then it will sum the equivalent cell in B14. You can offset these. It is best to have them parallel with each other. So you can do this if you want to, and it will change the result. And that first X will evaluate 16. But it's best to have these lined up in general, because while Excel can do that, it gets very, very confusing for users and even yourself if you put the Excel book down for a couple hours or a couple days or months and you come back to it. So I'd recommend keeping those lined up. Countif is same kind of concept, except it's testing and counting the same range. So because it doesn't really need to reference to sum anything else up, it's just going to, in this case, check for Y in this gold range, and then total up the Y's. That's all it is. So there's 3 Y's in this range. We have a 3 right here. Again, we're just specifying the range and then specifying the criteria that we're looking to meet. And the criteria here doesn't have to be a string or a text. It can also be a reference to another cell or even another entire formula or function inside of it. So let's make it a little bit more complicated. Sumifs, that's if with an S after it, has one or more conditions. So everywhere you can use a Sumif, you can also use a Sumifs, but you can also put additional requirements on it. And the format gets a little bit reversed here. So in this case, the Sumifs formula, you specify what you're going to add first. So we're going to add up the maroon only if this gold is an X and this gold is a Y. So in that case, there's an X and a nothing here, so we don't add that up. There's a nothing and a Y, so we don't add that up. There's an X and a Y here, so we take the 1, and then nothing and Y, and X, so those 2 are out also. So we just end up with a 1, or the 17, because again, I have these as random. But we just end up with that value there to total, because we only have the X and the Y here in this row together. Countifs is a similar thing. We're just going to count up the number of rows almost that meet the requirements that we're putting forth. So again, we don't really need this, or we don't need the sum range at all. But if there's a Y here and a Z here is what we specified in D44 through 48, or this goal, then we have the Y and the Y and the Y here. But this Y does not have a Z in this gold range. So we only total at 2. And again, the actual example formulas are all below these. So let's do something a little bit more practical real quick. We're going to scroll over here and we're going to look at student term credit hours. We're going to say that we want how many students are full-time in this example data. And we can do that by saying we have a full-time check right here, which is this formula. Just paste it up there for your reference. And we have this formula right here to count K3, the goal through K20, or in this actual case from the columns and everything that's been changing, K9 through K26. Then count it up if it says yes. So in this case, we have 5 yeses, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then how many of those full-time students, or how many credit hours are all of those full-time students taking together? And in this case, it's 99 because that's the 21 because of the yes, 18 because of the yes, and so on. But let's actually look at this here, because we're asking if J3 is greater than 11, then say yes, it's full-time, otherwise it's no. We're using 12 as a full-time, but that's not everybody's full-time. We have more than one type of career here. We have grads, and grads have a 9-hour, at least according to the late night Google I did because I didn't remember it, have a 9 credit hour full-time line. So in this case, we added something a little bit more complex to it. We added a career column to specify if they're grad or undergrad. And then we have a formula here adding up the number of hours in this range if this range matches this value next to it. So it's kind of saying, oh, there's grad next to me, so I'm going to add up 9. And so I have that here, and that's each individual line then has its own evaluation. There's a better way to do this, but this is how we're doing it for the example. Then full-time just takes the hours that they have for the term and then compares it with a greater than to the career full-time term -1 to make, because we're just dealing with full numbers here, and then gives you a yes or a no. So in this case, we have a lot of full-times here, and we have a formula there just pasted over, as well as the full-time formula. And then we have 4 questions here. Again, I'm running a little long, so I'm just going to speed through this part. But you can use the Countif formula in this box to figure out how many of these students are full-time. And that should really just focus here. How many full-time grads, which you count ifs, and that's if this is yes and this is a grad. And then all the undergrad credits you can sum if, so that's add these up if this is undergrad. And then total all undergrad full-time credits use Sumifs. So that's undergrad and full-time, then add up this. And these are locked in place because there's a little surprise here in this cell once you get all of these correct. But I'll save that for your time. Lookups. So this is where we get a little bit more fun, complicated, 2-dimensional, it might be, with the formulas and the functionality. Match is the most basic lookup that there is in Excel, and it is still 1-dimensional. It just looks up either a row or a column. And in this case, we have, again, those names that I just found online. It's just random generator. And fictional places here that some of you may recognize some of. And we have the Ruth is being looked for here in this list, and Shire is being looked for here in this list. So that's to demonstrate that you can look at either a column or a row, and it will return the number cell or the index that it is within that range. So in this case, Ruth is the 5th cell in the range here, and Shire is the 3rd cell in the range. And again, these formulas are example formulas that would be used in this kind of format. Vertical lookup. This is the actual part that I talked about earlier that I'm really excited to have display. It's a little bit more of an advanced formula. This is kind of when we're breaking into advanced formulas. The lookups themselves are two-dimensional formulas. They will take either a column or row, and they can also take an array, like an actual two-dimensional array. So in this case, this is the actual array that we're looking at. And we don't really need this. These are just here for illustration purposes. In this case, the vertical lookup, which is by far more used than the horizontal lookup, which we'll also get to, has a few more ingredients than some of the others, and it's a little bit more technical looking, but it's not actually that difficult. The lookup value is the first ingredient here, and that's what we're looking for. So we're looking for some value. Obviously, if you're going to look something up, you have something in mind that you want to look for. So in this case, it's actually this 140 cell right here. The table array is the one or two-dimensional array that we'll be looking at for this data. However, vertical lookup will only look at the first column in your array, whereas horizontal lookup will only look at the first row. So that's why I've highlighted this in red, because of this array, vertical lookup will only be looking for the lookup value in the first column. After it finds, if it finds a match for the lookup value, then it will go over a specified number of columns, or the column index number. And I actually misspoke there. I said go over a number of columns. However, that's actually go over to a column number. And the difference between that is if it goes over 5, in this case, then you actually end up in column 6 because the first column is 1. So if you go down to 140 and then you go right to the 5th column, that is 144. And this is just counting, obviously. But you can go ahead and you can click this button and you can see all the different ways that this formula works. And then there's one other term in here, which is technically optional, but I always type it in because you generally need it to be false, especially if you're using like student data and you're looking for specific students, then you will definitely want it to be false. So this range lookup value, true means it's an approximate lookup. Now it's true because it's asking if the data is sorted. In this case, it is technically sorted. So it's in order, and once it matches, there won't be like a better match down the line. False means it's not sorted, and you want the lookup formula to look for exactly the match of the value that you're looking for in the first place. So in this case, we have 30. If the maroon number here was 35, then the lookup itself would still return the 36 here, because 30, instead of 30, it would be 35. 30 is the closest match without going over, like Price is Right rules, to 35. So if you were actually to type in 35 right here, then it would still return the conditional formatting breaks, but and it would still return 39 here because that's still the 10th column or value in the row that is for 30, because there's no 35 row. So it just goes to 30, says up, 40 is higher, and then it goes across to 39 there. And you can even specify, I just want it from the first cell. So you can play around with that if you'd like. You can just hit F9. You can just hold F9 if you want, and just see it dance around. But that's the Vlookup. The Hlookup is pretty much the same, except the value is being looked for in the first row, and then it goes down to the index row number that you specify in the formula. The having these referenced here, let me unprotect this so we can show it. So there's the actual references again, ignore the font size. But it goes right in the first row to 9, and then it goes down to the 17th row of the entire range. And you'll note again, these numbers aren't actually in the array, in the table, because Excel just knows inherently how many rows there are in your selection. But you'll note that all of these are references inside of the formula, and the examples right here, except for the true or false, because you should specify that every time. And that's because you can design something like this, or something that references other reports to kind of compare things, or validate things, or just fill in or reorder something without necessarily sorting the original copy, if you just need it kind of custom sorted in a way. So that said, let's look over here. And we have, in this case, a match example. We have a list of numbers here, and then we have a different list of numbers here, and we just want to see where each of these numbers are in this list. Or we might want to just check to see if all of these numbers are in another list. This can be used for lists of student IDs, obviously, but I hadn't quite done the random student IDs like you see below. Again, no actual student information. And if you get a result with the match formula here, we'll show that. If you get a result with a match formula, then you know that it's in that other range. If you don't get a result, then you know it's missing. So there's no 530 in this list, which we see since it's sorted, there isn't. And that's match. And then for lookups here, say we have, again, a different list of IDs. You may want to be like grabbing different addresses or classes or majors or plans or careers or something from another data table of some sort, just ad hoc if you already have the data. But we're just going to use the names here, names to kind of visualize it better. So for populating, say, a new list, you'd want to go equals Vlookup. You'll reference the ID because we're looking for the ID in this table here. Again, your tables will be much larger. And then the column index number that we want for the last name is 1, 2, 3. So we're going to put 3 there. And then we're going to do false because while it is sorted, this is a student ID and we don't want to return someone else's name for this student ID. We want this student's name. So we're going to do that, and it returns Stewart there, which is right there. You can do the same thing for the first and the rest of the last as well. However, if you were to, say, fill this down with our Shift, click, and Control D, if you wanted to do that, you'll note that a lot of them error out. And that's because of the relative references that we were talking about. So the first cell or the first formula is fine, but the second one, you'll see it offsets the lookup table here. So we can fix that very quickly by going into here, hitting F2, and we can bring the formula back up, and we can hit F4. F4 will actually cycle through 4 states of absolute or relative reference. In this case, the row and the column will not change for the start of the range, which is this U27, the top left corner here. But the W46 here, this bottom corner, will still change. This is useful if you want to like do a sliding total or a sliding lookup of any kind for some other reason, and you want to specify a range that is always all of the cells above it. Say if you're filling in a progressive log of some kind, and you just want it to look up something based on everything you've done before. So in this case, we're just going to hit F4, and we're going to lock the entire table rows and columns into place. I'm going to hit enter, and then we're going to drag this back down. We'll just double click this time. There we go. And you can see that now, instead of being offset, the ID reference continues to go down with the formula, but the table stays the same. Skipping over to validation here, we've populated the table, but say we need to see if IDs are in another table, like the match formula up here, or we just want to check to see if the formula or if the data is consistent, then we can do the lookup, look up the ID here. I'm sorry, the ID table array. And actually, if you are making the formula, then right when you make the table array here, when you drag that out, you can actually hit F4 once, and it will just make the entire reference for the table absolute. Then the column index number, we're actually going to return the ID here. Actually, let's return the last name. And we're going to make sure that the last names all match. And then we're going to do false again, because student IDs, so we want to make sure that we're returning exactly that student's ID. In this case, we have Stuart. We'll go down here and we'll just look here. It looks like Connor Bark here is actually supposed to be Connor Clark. That's convenient for our illustration purposes here. But now we have seen that we can find validation issues, and we can even go one step further, and we can say equals last name. And then we have a much simpler time of doing this. And then we see we have exactly one false. If you have, say, several thousand rows, then you could do something like this, where you go equals count, right? If, Countif, range, you can select your entire column, and then you can type false. And you can see that you have one false throughout the entire column there. So this is useful for validating reports. Say if you're, I don't know, sending out student enrollment information weekly, as the RegTech department does. Make sure that the data is accurate by using validations such as this. A little bit more complex, as you probably see here shortly, but that's the general gist of it. And you can repeat the process over here as well. But we are going to move on real quick to something a little bit more fun and colorful, formatting. So all I mean here is conditional formatting, and it is complete now. But I mean not complete by the fact that you can just play with this entire tab. So this tab is not locked whatsoever. You can just delete the whole thing if you want. But just you can make up a label, you can fill in some numbers and use conditional formatting. Conditional formatting is located under home and conditional formatting. And then these are 3 examples of rules you can use. You'll see greater than and duplicate values here. And then top percent is in the top bottom rules menu. And all you have to do to use it is select the data you want to use it on. We're just going to do this real quick. There we go. So you just select the data you want to use it on, go to home, conditional formatting, highlight cells, and duplicate values. And then you can pick how the formatting shows up. You can even customize it if you'd like. You can put borders around it, whatever you want to do. You can hit OK, and that will apply to that range. There's much more advanced things you can do with conditional formatting and even conditional formatting as well, to evaluate it off of a formula and have progressive logic on it. But and you can see how that's executed here. If you go to Lookups, and you can go into conditional formatting and manage rules, select the worksheet, and you can see all of the conditional formatting rules that are running on that page or that sheet. You can also see them for the other sheets as well while you're in one. So we'll go back here, and that is pretty much the entire base here, but I did promise VBA. It's very, very much higher level. So we're just going to skim the surface of it because it's extremely useful. VBA is Visual Basic for Applications. It is some rudimentary programming actually built into Excel, and it's been there for decades. And they've just made it better and more functional as time has gone on. The most basic use of VBA is a macro. A macro is a set of instructions that you specify that Excel will just automatically carry out or carry out based on a trigger. In this case, the trigger is a button here. And all I did was make it that, put that just that text into this box, and then clear will clear it out. So it's just two very basic VBA scripts or macros here. These are the steps. You will need the developer menu enabled. I don't know if the permissions are really there, but it's inside of the options menu. And I did not look at this before, and I've had it enabled for years, so I don't really know. And I've locked it up now. So we'll wait for that. But while we're waiting for that, you go into the developer menu, you hit record macro. You can do whatever the task is that you want the button or something else to repeat. And I think it's, you can find it in Google or just hit me up at some point via email, and I'll let you know how to enable it. But right here is the record macro button. You can hit that. You can do whatever actions you would like to have Excel do automatically. And then you can hit stop recording, which is the same button right here once you're done. And then you can go to macros, and you can actually look here and edit. And this is where it gets into kind of the programming view. So let me just, there it is. I'm going to do this, sharing the full screen here. So this looks more complicated than it is, but this is a Visual Basic editor. All this is a list of worksheets that you have in the workbook, some tools up top here, and then sub, which starts the macro. The name of the macro, which I just left, is macro 1. These are comments. This is nothing. And then this is the active cell, or whatever cell you have selected when the button's clicked. Just make that cell equal to this. That's all it is. It just puts that in the contents of the cell, and then it's done. And that's the macro assigned to this first button here. The second button just has selection.clear contents, which all I did to generate this was I had this cell selected. I hit record macro, and I typed in this is a test of the button you clicked. And then I stopped recording the macro, and it made this macro for me. As for this one, all I did was hit record macro. I hit delete, and then I stopped recording, and this is the macro as well. So you don't really even have to write as much. You can absolutely write this. You can change this so it changes a different, like, specific cell, specific worksheet, even a specific other workbook if you want to. But that's kind of a very, very bare basic introduction to VBA there. The only thing we left out is how to put a button onto the page. And that's, again, inside of the developer menu. You just hit insert, and there's this form controls and ActiveX controls. I've only ever done form controls. And you just drag out the button, pick a macro that you'd like to assign to it, and it just creates a button there. And then you just can use the button. All right, that concludes the run through the workbook here. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me directly afterwards or anytime. I'm happy to assist. Chris Smith and Rebecca and the team are also well versed in most of these things, and everybody on the team has seen it at least once before. So I'm sure they'd be happy to answer questions. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and kind of turn it over. Go ahead. I saw you unmute. Haley.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for this wonderful presentation. And also thank you for taking the time to create that Excel workbook. I know it's going to be extremely helpful for the data community.